You describe yourself as a former practical atheist.
I thought it was theoretically possible that there was a God, but I thought that if there was a God, he was helpless just like I was. And there came a moment when I realized that I had not believed in God for quite some time, but I never knew when that had happened.
So what would you say now, back to your peak atheist self? What would you say, if anything?
Oh man, it would be hard. I would be tempted to grab my shoulders and shake myself.
Why would a young Christian abandon his faith and become a nihilist, in which he believed humans invented morality and free will is an illusion, and then come back to faith? What agonies and inconsistencies did he experience in his atheist life to convince him that God is real? Our guest today, Dr. J. Budziszewski, earned his PhD at Yale University and is now a professor of government and philosophy at the University of Texas. And he's the author of a fascinating and intriguing new book, Pandemic of Lunacy. Dr. J, we met about 20 years ago when I saw you on this discussion with Frank Beckwith in dialogue with two gay activists. I've been a fan in the sense of appreciating your work ever since. Have wanted to have you on for a long time, so thanks for being willing to join me.
Well, I'm very glad to be with you. And Frank is a great guy too.
He's okay. Yeah, we'll give him that for now. Well, kidding aside, I really want to get into your story. So let's kind of go back to the beginning. What was your family like growing up, and were you serious about your faith?
Oh, I was very serious about my faith. It was a very devout family. It was a Baptist family. My grandfather baptized me, as a matter of fact. He was a Baptist minister. He was, I believe, the first minister of a Polish-speaking congregation in the United States, Polish-speaking Baptist congregations.
Oh.
And we used to talk for hours about God, and I talked with my parents too, of course, but he was very influential. And I know that he was alarmed for me when he saw me slipping away, and he asked the right questions, but but I did abandon that, and so it wasn't because I didn't know anything about faith that I got out of it. It wasn't because I hadn't been properly instructed. It was nothing like that. I didn't have any excuse. So that was that. Well, I guess I was what you might call, I've used this expression before. Have you ever heard it? Pious but not holy. I was a selfish, greedy little kid, like a lot of little kids, but I was full of all these ideas about God.
So baptized by your grandfather, that's remarkable. There's a tradition here. I want people to realize how deep this goes and likely how unsettling it was for your family. How old were you? What were some of the questions or arguments or experiences that made you kind of at least first pause and say, wait a minute, maybe I don't want to be a Christian?
Well, I wish that I could say that there had been a lot of questions that gave me serious intellectual pause, or arguments that had been presented to me that made me think God couldn't be real, Jesus Christ couldn't be the Son of God. But in fact, I was much more influenced by other non-rational motivations. I told myself that I was being very intellectual, that I saw through all that stuff. But the fact is that I was in an environment, especially after I went off to college, I was in an environment in which all the smart people denied Christian faith or were indifferent to it. And I viewed myself as one of the smart people. I didn't ever think to myself, oh, I want to be in with the smart people, but that kind of thing usually isn't altogether conscious. Then there were other motivations in my life. My politics, which were very radical in those days, radical left-wing politics, became a substitute faith. And for a while, I tried to hang on to some shred of Christianity. I told myself Jesus is a cultural revolutionary, all this sort of thing, but that's different than saying that he was the Son of God. When I went off to college, my wife and I, for a while, attended a congregation. It was pretty wild and woolly. In Holy Communion, the minister would hold up a grape and talk about the grape boycott, and this had nothing to do with Jesus. I thought, gee, that's cool. There's also the fact that I had committed certain sins that I did not want to repent. They were in that sense sticky, clinging, and And so I was looking for reasons to avoid God, or reasons not to believe that he was paying attention. But at the bottom of everything, really, was just the fact that I didn't want God to be God. I wanted J. Budziszewski to be God.
Mm.
This is this is the primordial temptation, and so nothing original there. Same thing that hit our first parents.
So you sent me a fascinating article kind of that describes your journey. And there's another podcast or two I came across, and you describe yourself as a former practical atheist. I'm
Yes,
curious what you mean by that, as opposed to what might be called a theoretical atheist.
a theoretical atheist is one who says, "I know there is no God. I can be sure of that." A practical atheist is somebody who lives as though there is no God. And he may believe, I did. I thought it was theoretically possible that there was a God,
Mm.
but I thought that if there was a God, he was helpless just like I was. I didn't think there was such a thing as free. And I thought that my reasons for concluding that about myself applied to him too. He would be an impotent God if he existed at all. So there was no point in thinking about him. It's funny at the university level. I sometimes say that practical atheism is the university's established religion, its official religion. It isn't that the university says you must not believe in God or you must not believe in Jesus Christ, but it says, well, if you do believe in God, he can't make a difference. You have to be sure that he's not going to make a difference. Your scholarship, everything else about you has to be just like all of the materialists, all of the atheists, all of the other people around you. The out and out theoretical atheists are probably in a minority, but they also have the upper hand. They determine the terms of the intellectual conversation in the academy, and so I fit in very well with that, I'm afraid.
Mm. I'd be curious if you agree with this. I often tell my students, I taught high school full-time and part-time 21 years before coming to Biola Talbot School of Theology. And I tell my students this, so you might have some professors, like a handful, that are aggressive in their atheism or worldview, but need to be even more careful about just the subtle dismissal of Christianity and the assumptions that come across far more common than the direct assaults. Do you agree with that? And do you see that in your experience in the academy?
I've seen both. I suppose it depends on which courses you take. Students tend to
Mm.
self-select. If somebody is going to go into, I don't know, women's studies or queer studies or something like that, they're probably going to meet some very, very aggressive atheists. On the other hand, most people who are practical atheists, as I say, aren't going to present an argument against belief in God in the classroom. But if a student says anything that is God dependent, they'll treat it as irrelevant. Well, we're not talking about God here, ma'am. We're talking about so and so. Or there'll be that subtle little raising of the eyebrow. Now I raise my eyebrows too, and I always have to tell my students that's just how I look at people. That doesn't mean I'm down on you.
Sure.
But there's that subtle little raising of the eyebrow, or there's the pause before answering.
Mm.
Um, a friend of mine once, he was a Christian. Uh, he managed to hold on to his Christian faith all through college and all through military service and all through graduate school. And here he was in a graduate seminar, and his teacher said, "All of us here are too intelligent to be pro-life, right?"
Mm.
And he
Mm.
was silent. He said nothing. I asked him about this. Why? Why didn't you speak up? He knew he shouldn't, but the atmosphere just, it was like swimming away against the current. He became a much more courageous person later on, but he just couldn't do it. That's very intimidating to, it should, I mean, look, this ex-army guy, it shouldn't have been intimidating to him, but social pressure like that can in some ways be scarier than a guy aiming a gun at you.
There's social pressure, there's grade pressure, there's
Yes.
relational pressure. There's all kinds of pressure in that moment. I have a lot of grace for that, as long as, like you said, he learns from it and processes it and moves forward and does better next time. But those moments are somewhat hard to prep for. And you're right, they have a deep effect on somebody's sense of, like, wait a minute, I'm the only one here who doesn't believe this. Maybe I'm not that intellectual. Maybe I'm wrong. It's those seeds of doubt that I think can really be powerful in a kid's faith.
A friend of mine told me, I haven't read the research myself, so I can't, I'm presenting this secondhand. I can't be sure of it, but he had looked into the research and said that according to some sociologists, some social psychologists, if even one person in a group expresses the non-majority opinion, other people then feel more free to express it themselves.
Ah,
You know, they feel they're not alone. That one person makes an enormous difference. It opens the floodgates. So if you feel like I'm alone, I can't make any difference to the situation in any way, you may not be as alone as you think, and you may make an enormous difference to the situation.
I love that. Acting in courage gives other people the confidence and the courage to act
Hmm.
as well. Let's shift back to your story. Was there
Sure.
a moment, and I know like sometimes people ask me, I went through a period of doubt, really came back to my faith. People are like, when was that moment? I'm like, I don't know that there was a moment. It was really subtle, but was there
Yeah.
defining experiences of two things when you just kind of said, you know what? I am an atheist. I own that title. And what happened when you told your family? How did they respond?
I don't think I ever did tell my family out and out. I mean, I had long
Mm.
conversations with my wife, but my parents, for example, I started talking in a different way, and they understood this well enough. And I can remember my mother confronting me about this. And I said, well, if there really is a loving God, he's not going to send me to hell because I don't believe in him. Glib answer, right? But, of course, it wasn't just a matter of loss of head belief. This changes your whole life.
Mm.
And I was there a moment? You know, people sometimes say, I saw this happen, and at that moment I stopped believing in God, or somebody presented to me the gospel, or I woke up in the gutter one morning, and and I said, God, I believe. I never had either of those two kinds of moments. What happened is I was drifting out of faith for a long time, and there came a moment when I realized that I had not believed in God for quite some time, but I never knew when that had happened.
Mm.
Then there was a later moment when well, the first moment was actually I didn't believe in Jesus Christ. The second moment was later on. I came to realize I hadn't been believing in God for quite some time. And when I came back, it was actually much the same way. There was a process, but it wasn't as though at 7:28 on October 23rd, all of a sudden I thought, I believe that never happened. But I came to be aware I have been believing again for some time now, and I didn't notice.
Mm.
But I just acknowledged that as I owned that as in your phrase. Yeah, and I think that that was mercy, actually. If
Huh.
I had not argued my way out of faith, I had not been presented. Oh, I vaguely knew about some of the arguments against the existence of God, but I had not. It wasn't because of them that I lost my faith. It was through intellectual pride and a process that I was convinced was intellectual, but it wasn't. And so I think that it was important to my recovery. It was the mercy of God that He brought me back in a way that wasn't altogether. I didn't reason my way back into faith either. It
Mm.
was after I discovered that I believed again, and it disturbed me. I thought, but why? I couldn't have told you at that time. It wasn't for about 2 years, after a period of time in which God was putting my mind back together, that I began to be able to say, well, this is why returning to faith actually made sense. This is why it's still faith, but it's reasonable. This is why I can rationally believe that God exists. It wasn't until after those 2 years that I was able to give a rational reconstruction. So you see, this shattered my intellectual pride. It
Mm.
meant uh, it meant you're not so great after all, Budziszewski. You ran away from me without even thinking about it, and it'll be your own act coming back under my grace, but there'll be nothing here that you can take any intellectual pride in.
Mm.
So when I give apologetical arguments, when I write about the philosophy of theism, and I talk about how we know how faith is not the same as reason, but it's reasonable. When I talk about these things, I always have to remind myself, you didn't argue yourself back into faith.
Mm.
And I also have to remember that that means that the process by which other people may come to faith, there are rational elements in this, and there were in my case too. There are rational elements, but it's not just a matter of philosophical argumentation. Um, Many of my students, for instance, they may say, well, why do you believe this? And I'll say, for such and such a reason. How would you reply to this objection? I say, for such and such a reason. And I say, do you see any fault in that reasoning? And they say no. Are they instantly converted? Do they instantly change their mind? No. But they think I'm a pretty intelligent guy. The most important step here is the discovery that somebody whom they think is an intelligent guy could believe this, which they didn't know before. Or that an argument can be given for this, which they didn't know before. That's more psychological than it is purely philosophical.
So what would you say now, some decades later, we don't have to give specifics, back to your peak atheist self? What would you say, if anything?
What was it like?
Yeah, what would you say to yourself if you were able to
what would I say to myself?
Back to yourself? Yeah.
Oh man. It would be hard. I would have to I would be tempted to grab my shoulders and shake myself.
Okay.
But I hope I would have talked to myself the way that I talk to some people today. They say crazy things sometimes to me. And there are three things that you can do in response to people's objections and questions. People can sometimes ask a simple question. Like, why is Jesus called Christ? Is that his last name or something? And you can answer a simple question. You can answer an honest intellectual question with an honest intellectual answer. Or they may have an objection. They may say, well, if God was really good and all powerful, then there wouldn't be any suffering in the world, right? You can give an honest intellectual answer to that. But a lot of things are not honest intellectual. They may look like honest intellectual objections, but they aren't. That's only the presenting argument. What they really are is smokescreens, so that they don't have to really face the God question. It happens very often that you may be talking to somebody, and I would have been like this too. You talk to somebody, and you have he may have 100 objections, and you give 100 responses. And he doesn't see anything wrong with any of them, but he keeps having objections. And I will sometimes say to people, suppose that we just blocked out 2 weeks from our schedule and did nothing except talk about all your objections to this thesis or that thesis. There is a real good and evil. There is a God, whatever. There is a natural law. And suppose we just did nothing but talk about that. And suppose that at the end of that time, I had answered every one of your objections to your complete intellectual satisfaction. Somebody says usually, well, you couldn't do it. And I'll say, this is a thought experiment. Suppose I could. And he says, well, okay. And I'll say, well, then would you change your mind? Very often they say no. That means it was all a smokescreen. You answer an honest intellectual objection with an honest intellectual reply, but a smokescreen, you try to blow away the smoke. So what I say in a case like that is, well, then, these objections weren't your real reason for not accepting this conclusion, or believing in this proposition, or believing in this God. What do you suppose is your real reason? And that sometimes really can be staggering to some people. Or there was another guy, he said to me, this has happened several times, he said, something, I don't remember what it was, but it was incoherent. You know what I mean by incoherence? Incoherence isn't just inconsistency, but it's like if a deconstructionist professor stands in front of his English class and says, now, I want you to understand this. No one can ever recover the meaning of any speaker. Well, he's just pulled out the rug that he was standing on, because then how can they understand it? That's an incoherency. And he had said something incoherent to me. And I said, do you realize that you've just been incoherent? And he said, huh? And I said, and I explained. And he said, yeah, I guess I am incoherent. And then he said, but that's okay, because the universe is incoherent anyway, and I don't need any meaning or truth in my life. Now, once upon a time, and maybe I hope I would have known better than answering this way to my younger self. Once upon a time, I would have answered somebody like that by thinking, oh my gosh, this poor guy, he doesn't know he needs meaning and truth in his life. He thinks the universe is incoherent. I have to convince him that that isn't true. I know better now. He knows that.
Mm.
He knows that. It's a smokescreen. So instead, what I've asked is, I don't believe you. I say, you know as well as I do that the longing for meaning and truth is deep set in every created intellect, yours as well as mine. So tell me, what is it that you want so much that you're willing to do without meaning and coherency to have it?
Mm.
And that sort of knocks them back for a while too. They don't have a clever answer. They may come back with a clever answer after a minute and a half, but the fact that it takes them so long is itself a good thing, because they will remember that 90 seconds when they were struggling. It
Mm.
will get under their skin. It will bother them, and that maybe it will make it more likely that for another maybe 2.5 minutes this 2 minutes this time, maybe 5 minutes this time, the window will open with the next person who's trying to talk to them, and finally something can get in.
So you're talking about a few students you've had who know there's meaning, know there's truth, but you also talk about how when you were an atheist, you knew that God existed. What do you mean, and how did you know God was real even though you identified as an atheist?
I told myself at the time that I didn't know that God existed, or that if he did exist, he didn't, he couldn't possibly make any difference to anything. I told myself that. It wasn't until after I came back to faith that I realized that I had been lying to myself. I'd been pulling the wool over my own eyes. Deep down, I did know. Deep down, that was why my practical atheism, my nihilism, was so disturbing to me. I knew that he was really there. I also knew, I told myself there was no objective difference between good and evil, no rationally discernible difference. That it was the difference was just something we make up, we humans, just applicable to that human point of view. We happen to evolve this way. Okay, this is why we think this is good. I really knew better than that too. I was deceiving myself about that also, and it's a miserable situation to be in. Uh, I I it's God can use any repented sin, and He has made use of this episode in my life because a large part of my work is about what's called natural law theory, what St. Paul called the
Yeah.
law written on the heart. And there are people who do all kinds of things. People say, what kind of a universe must it be that there can be a natural law? Or they say, can natural law help us in moral apologetics or in cultural apologetics? Or they say, can the natural law help us to answer difficult moral questions? Or what's the history of the natural law tradition and how has it influenced jurisprudence or not? Or they ask this or they but what I do is I'm mostly interested. I've done some of that stuff, but I'm mostly interested in how is it, if there's a natural law, if there are really some things that we can't not know about good and evil, about right and wrong, then how is it that we can tell ourselves that we don't know them? And how is it that we can lie to ourselves? So my own experience as having lied to myself so long has given me some insight into that, insight which I couldn't have had while I was in it. It's just like you kill yourself, you won't have any insight into suicide. Not afterward. Only before, if then.
Mm.
A drug addict is not the one who knows the most about a drug addiction, but you get out of it and you know something. So that was that's what I mean by the difference. I knew it, but I denied it,
Mm.
and self so much of there is such a thing as honest ignorance about all kinds of points of detail. But about some of the big ticket items, like is there a moral law? Nobody is really ignorant. An awful lot of what passes for ignorance is really self-deception. And we're going to get nowhere in our conversations if we don't recognize the difference.
Mm. That's a great distinction. Now, you went so far as to write a doctoral dissertation at
Oh,
Yale
yes.
in which you argued that we make up and invent the difference between good and evil, and hence aren't responsible for what we do. So maybe just tell us the heart of your argument, and how did you
Oh,
get
God.
hired with such an argument at the university spouting this to college students?
Actually, it was the other way around. I first argued that we aren't
Oh,
responsible for our actions. And if we aren't responsible for our actions, that it follows that the conclusions that we come to about right and wrong are not in our control.
Mm.
nor are the conclusions that we come to about anything else, nor are even the conclusions that we come to about whether we are responsible for our actions. Now, I was caught in an incoherency there, but that's let's set that aside. Now, if this was the case, then we had no rational grounds to be confident of any of our judgments about good and evil. So I said, these aren't rational judgment. Now, this is really loony. You asked a follow-up question about that. Oh, how did I get hired anywhere? Well, okay, I gave my dog and pony show, as they call it. I gave
Sure.
my job talk, and basically here I am in front of. There was a sort of a war going on in the department that hired me at that time between the members of one faction who thought this is how you should study politics and society, and the members of another faction who thought this is the way. And one faction thought that I was a smuggled in candidate of the other faction, and they were waiting to see if I believed in any of those things about something called rational choice theory. And I didn't. I just talked about how we ultimately were not, there is no rationally discernible difference between good and evil, and ultimately we're not responsible for our acts anyway. And I had some ideas for how to reform or reconstruct political science, the study of government, on that basis. And they said, oh, good, he's not one of them. Give him a job teaching the young.
Mm.
So my colleagues, were most of them that far out? No, but apparently it wasn't important to them. And I didn't have any trouble for that ever until I was up for tenure. By this time, I had returned to Christian faith, and my colleagues were beginning to have some serious trouble with me then for that reason.
Oh, that's really interesting. So presumably there was a season where you were teaching this to students. So how did most students respond? And were there Christian students who pushed back? Did they do a good job? Like, what was it like for that season teaching things that you now look back at and think were incoherent and false?
Well, it was probably about a year and a half of
Mm.
teaching before I came back to God. And the teaching itself was one of the things that God used, I think, to draw me back, because I would, all right, I would teach Aristotle, I would teach Thomas Aquinas, the great Christian thinker of the Middle Ages, I would teach some other people, because I thought, well, this is good stuff. Um, Now, when I would read Thomas Aquinas, when I would teach Thomas Aquinas, the impression that it conveyed to me of very truth was so powerful that I wanted to weep. But I kept telling myself, it can't be true. It can't be true. There really isn't any truth. And I just tried to teach my students. Well, apparently some of them picked up on that. One of my students once, I was, I was, I was nothing at that time. I had not returned to faith. One of my students came up to me after class. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was Catholic, and he said to me, "I've been listening to you since the beginning of the semester. Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Well, sure. I don't guarantee I'll answer, but you can ask anything that you want to." And he said, "You sound to me like you're either an atheist or a Roman Catholic. Which is it?"
Are you serious? That's
I am serious. I am serious. People said all kinds of crazy things. Uh, one of my a professor at Yale University, when I was still doing my doctoral dissertation. He didn't know what my dissertation was about. We didn't have a close relationship, but I knew him. We mixed together in the dining hall and that kind of thing. And he says, so what are you studying? What are you doing? And I said, well, I'm studying Friedrich Nietzsche. That was the philosopher who said God is dead. And he said, huh, you better watch out studying Nietzsche. The next thing you know, you'll be a Christian.
huh.
Well, eventually I was, but not that fast. And that to him would have been a very displeasing outcome.
Mm. Now, I could guess, but somebody might say if you read Nietzsche, he draws out the implications of there being no God. And maybe that's what would make people realize, oh my goodness, if there's no God, no human value, we're all left with power. That is not the way the world is. That's not what's good. So let's go the opposite direction. Is that what he meant? How Nietzsche could bring someone to God?
He might have. I
Hmm.
suspect that he might have been thinking about some people that he knew.
Oh, interesting.
He didn't strike me as a person who thought. I don't think that he was a. He might have been some kind of an abstract theist. I don't think he was a Christian, and so I don't think that he'd in any penetrating way thought about these questions of faith himself. But he just warned me, people who start getting into that, they take all this stuff seriously, and then they may be someplace else.
Mm.
Uh, Many of my professors were. You mentioned that Nietzsche tried to follow out the implications of his ideas. Many of my professors at that time held those ideas, but resolutely refused to follow them all the way to their conclusions.
Interesting.
And I used to sort of push back against them, and I claimed that that was what I was doing in my dissertation. And they said, "Well, okay, but Nietzsche, in some ways, he did push his premises to its conclusions. In some ways, he didn't, because he thought, well, if there isn't any objective difference between good and evil, then you just have to create your own good and evil, create your own tablets of value." Well, I'll give him this. He recognized that in order to create your own value, you would have to create your own universe,
Mm.
which is essentially what he said we all do. But he kept trying to, despite himself, believe in something objective after all. There's no objectivity. You mentioned power. Therefore, there's only power. Well, I'm sorry. If you can't express any objective truth, then everything is all power. You can't express either.
Mm.
Everything is all power. Everything isn't all power. You're left without that. At one point, Nietzsche is supposed to have told somebody everything. Once you understand this, the only thing that you can do is either laugh or be silent. And what I'd concluded was you couldn't even do that, because you had lost any motive for doing anything.
Mm.
That's a pretty rotten position to find yourself in. I mean, look, I loved my wife and children. I did, but I couldn't understand it anymore, because love is an enduring commitment of the will to the true good of another person. I no longer believed in persons, including myself. I no longer believed in good or evil, and I no longer thought my commitments were in control. That didn't mean I stopped loving them, but I couldn't make sense of love. And that's just, I never would have succeeded as the sort of pop culture kind of nihilist who says, nothing means anything. That's cool. Meaning's a drag. I never would have succeeded at that kind of thing, right?
Mm.
That's a person who's tried to find meaning in being cool. It was I was more the despairing kind of nihilist, and it was pretty rotten. But like Nietzsche, I told myself, this doesn't mean it has to be wrong. What it means is that at the heart of the universe is absolutely nothing. And I'm one of the ones who is strong enough to look that in the face and live. I will walk on the rocky heights where the air is thin and cold and survive. All this this macho nonsense, right? And it's very ridiculous. I was aware of the incoherencies and contradictions in my own thinking. And I just said, well, but I will take an ironic view of life, which is not a solution at all. But I'm not the only one to have said that. One famous philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who I think is maybe at a different place now, but Thomas Nagel said in a famous essay of his on absurdity, he said, well, if everything is absurd, we can face this with courage. And if everything is absurd, then courage is absurd too.
That's right.
And he didn't draw that final conclusion. The nihilist never does, because he can't. Because if he's right, then he can't be right. He can't draw the conclusion, because if he's right, there are no conclusions.
So you mentioned your wife and your kids during this season when you're kind of a nihilist and a materialist. Were you married when you were a Christian? Tell me a little bit how that fits into your journey.
We were married when we were about a year into college at 19 years of age, and I still think that was a good thing. People say, oh, don't marry until you've stopped changing. Don't marry until you're 35. You change together. And marriage is one of the things that kept my marriage to my wife and her love. And my children are one of the things that kept me from being a lot crazier than I would have been otherwise.
Mm.
Now, my wife was away from faith too. She had been a Christian and she had not abandoned it like me, but she had drifted away from it. She still, in some theoretical way, believed in God. And she would tell me when I would say all these crazy, deluded, nihilistic things, she wouldn't try to argue against me. She would just laugh. She would say, "You don't believe that."
Mm.
Nobody could believe that. I would say, "Yes, I do. Yes, I do." And of course, she was right.
Mm.
But it was years before I realized it. She was onto the fact that I was deluding myself, that I was deceiving myself, that I knew better. And it took years before I realized that that was true. When I returned to faith, she was on a different trajectory and a different arc back, but she came back by God's mercy at the same time I did.
That's remarkable.
And we were ready to do this. And as to you asked about the children, well, one of them was about 2, I guess, and the other one was 6 years older. And we sat them down on the sofa and we explained to them that as a family, we were going to start going to church. And I thought I was really going to get some pushback. They'd say, "Oh, there's less time to play. We're going to have to go to this place. I don't know what that is." And but they were perfectly compliant with this.
Oh.
And they were happy to go to church. I found that very curious. Years later in adulthood, the older daughter said to me that she remembered that. She remembers sitting on the sofa when we said we were going to start going to church and worshiping God. She remembers wiggling her feet. And she remembers being very happy because she had always wanted the family to go to church, but she'd never told us.
Mm.
Now there is the grace of God.
That's pretty cool. That's really neat. So did we miss any details about you coming kind of back to faith? You
Yeah.
talked about these
Oh, sure.
inconsistencies, your wife's role. Is there anything else a part of the story that's important to see?
Oh, yeah. When there was an evening once when I had my wife and I had a quarrel. We just didn't. I guess it's residue from having both been Christians earlier, having held Christian faith earlier. We didn't believe in divorce, but we were going through a pretty rough patch, and we'd had quite a quarrel. And she'd gone to bed. I was sitting in the sofa, and I'd been weeping.
Mm.
And I remembered something oddly that one of the youth ministers in my teenage church had said once. He said, "You can pray to God hypothetically. Even if you don't know he's there, you can pray to him." And I did. I said, "God, if there is a God, I don't think you're there.
Mm.
I think I'm talking to the wall. But if you are there, you can have me. But you're going to have to show me because I can't tell anymore." Well, the ceiling didn't open up, and there were no choirs of angels. Nothing happened. My tears dry up. The silence goes on and on and on. You hear the clock ticking in the other room, or humming. It was probably electric, and you think I was right. I was talking to the wall, but he heard me, and I didn't realize it. Over a period of about 6 weeks, a perception began to dawn on me that my own condition, even in the making of this prayer, I hadn't realized this, that my condition was objectively evil.
Mm.
Well, now I remember I'd been telling myself that there was no objective difference between good and evil. Here was an objective evil.
Mm.
Maybe I didn't know if anything else was objectively evil, but my condition was. Now, in my atheist period, paradoxically, I'd read all kinds of Christian stuff. Like I'd read Augustine of Hippo, and I'd read Thomas Aquinas, and I'd read all this stuff, and I'd read Dante, who was wonderful, and Augustine had presented what philosophers call the privation theory of evil. This is that the only way C.S. Lewis paraphrased it by saying that evil's a parasite on good. The only way you can get an evil thing is to take a good thing and ruin it. Evil is nothing but something missing in something that would otherwise be good, or something disordered in something that would otherwise be good. We don't say that a person who is healthy is missing some of his sickness. We say that a person who is sick is missing something in his health.
That's right.
So if there was an evil, then there had to be a good for this to be the perversion of. If there was a horrible, there had to be a wonderful for this evil to be the privation of. So gosh, that meant that there had to be a good and an evil. What? What? This meant, if this was true, this one slipped, I like to say it slipped past my mental censors, because if this was true, then it meant that I'd been so wrong for so long about so many things that almost anything could be true. And that was when I started reading, not reading them as philosophy, not reading them as things that had to do with my field, with my teaching, but reading things to see if they could be true. I devoured C.S. Lewis and other kinds of things. I reread the authors who I just mentioned, but with a different eye. And it was after that, after some period, that I realized for some time that I'd been believing again.
So if I'm tracking correctly, it wasn't so much an awareness of the failure of relativism, in the sense that, like, you can't have a moral reformer like Martin Luther King Jr. if relativism is the case, because he comes along, at least societal relativism, and tells the society that it's wrong. These are one example amongst others of the inconsistencies, incoherencies within relativism that nobody lives like it's true. It sounds like, if I understand correctly, there was an awareness of evil in your own heart, just moral failure, and then the reasoning kind of followed from that. Did I get the order right?
Almost. There was an awareness of misery. But since I was telling myself there's no objective good and no objective evil, I couldn't even call my misery evil.
Gotcha.
It was just, you know, the chipmunk is attached by the hawk. It suffers. It's not evil. This happens. That happens. People that even put that on bumper stickers. Stuff happens, although they don't use the word stuff. And I wasn't blasé about it, but I wouldn't have called that evil. The recognition, I called it a perception that my condition was objectively evil, was sort of earth-shattering for me, because it wasn't just a feeling. It was a perception. It was a recognition of something. It was as though I had been going around for years and thinking that the sky was pink, and suddenly I looked up and saw that it was blue. God had opened my eyes just enough to see that. And that led to everything else.
And there's so many pieces to this story I'm curious about, but tell me.
It's like one of those jigsaw puzzles with the pieces that don't fit together, because I was so crazy. But go ahead.
No, it's great. We're going to get to your book, Pandemic of Lunacy, here in a minute, but
Yeah.
because I'm a professor like you, I did my doctoral work on the death of the apostles, have a dissertation, published a book, 10 years later, published an update. And I was trying to assess whether or not I thought the apostles, the evidence pointed towards them dying naturally, it being unknown, or dying as martyrs. And in my update, after 10 years of interacting with scholars and researching more, I shifted on a couple of them slightly where I think the evidence points. And most people say, hey, that's great. You've thought about this. You've made your arguments more precise. This is a part of the academic process. But that's different than writing a defense at Yale that morality is invented and completely flipping and going the other direction. I'm curious, what was this like professionally? Did you do a response to yourself? Were people grateful that you shifted? I'm really curious how that landed and how you dealt with that academic shift.
Well, the first thing that happened was, hardly anybody actually, even in my department, even knew that this was going on, or after I returned to faith that it had been going on. This wasn't recognized until the time that I came up for promotion, and they began actually reading some of the stuff that I read, by which time I was saying Christian things, or at least Christian friendly things. And so that, that wasn't there wasn't a big reaction at first from people around me. in my own life, one of the biggest things was this: you're a nihilist, you don't believe in this stuff. In order to maintain the self-deception that there's no good and evil, that there aren't persons, we're not personally responsible for our actions, there's no God, you have to close your eyes to so many different things that would refute you.
Mm.
You have to even forget certain powerful memories that would convert you, that would persuade you. You have to, and you have to start learning to follow premises to their conclusions again, instead of trying to escape what the conclusions really would be with nonsense about an ironic view of life or something like that. And so God had to put my mind back together. I don't think any psychiatrist would have diagnosed me as clinically crazy. But from a Christian point of view, yeah, I was crazy, and my mind had to be put together.
Mm.
I had to learn what it is to think, what it is to cherish the truth. My memories, it was the oddest thing. Have you ever known anybody who was so maybe I know somebody like this. She got a divorce from a man. It was not a very pleasant divorce. She was so angry with him that in family pictures where he was in them, she'd scratch out his face.
Oh my goodness.
Now, I didn't scratch out anything from my memories, but there were things that I just didn't remember. And over this 2 years of reconstruction, I found memories reassembling themselves, becoming whole, remembering the things that I had not allowed myself to remember, even whole ways of feeling. This is I've used this metaphor before, and I hesitate to use it because to most people it's just going to sound like a literary device, a figure of speech, but it was as though it was literally happening. It was so powerful. It was as though I had been, for years, locked into a dark attic, and it was pitch black, and as though somebody was throwing open the shutters
Mm.
one at a time, and these beams of light that were like pillars, you could feel them, were coming in and illuminating the darkness and sparkling off the motes of dust. And it was staggering. Sometimes, I mean, that's how it felt. That's different than perceiving this truth or perceiving that truth or
Sure.
perceiving that truth, although that was going on too. It was this sensation. There was also a sensation of battle, actually. I thought that I had never thought very much about spiritual entities above us, other than God, created beings like angels. But I had a feeling of spiritual warfare taking place over me,
Mm.
which I believe God's servants do for every soul. And my condition was still pretty precarious.
Mm.
So that's what it was like. It probably will make your listeners think he really was loony. Why should I listen to him now?
Well,
I, I
I
assure them I'm not haunting the supermarkets with a butcher knife in my hand.
no, you're not. And you've written a book. I have one more question before we get to it, but Pandemic of Lunacy, where you're just talking about let's clearly think and reflect upon kind of this cultural moment that we're in and mistakes that have been made in the past. But I have
Right.
one more question. You've been working with students, I don't know, maybe 3 decades or so in the classroom. Do you sense that students are different now? Openness to spiritual things, the questions that they ask, maybe more nihilistic in the other direction. Do you sense students are different in the time that you've been working with them in the classroom?
I've noticed that every 5 years or so I see shifts.
Mm.
And some shifts are encouraging, some shifts are like a double-bladed sword. It can either be discouraging, or you see two possibilities, one of which is very encouraging, one is discouraging. Once the topic of sexual ethics, marriage, fidelity in marriage came up in class almost accidentally, and I didn't want the students to think that I was condemning them. But I said, I have some compassion for your generation because my generation invented the sexual revolution, and it seems to me that yours is paying the price.
Mm.
One of the young men in the class said, I know exactly what you mean. More than anything, I want to find a woman and fall in love with her and love her faithfully forever and get married. But I don't think it's possible.
Mm.
Now, that's heartbreaking. At the beginning of this little speech, my heart had soared. At the end of it, I was crushed. The good thing about this was that he was recognizing, as people earlier in the sexual revolution didn't recognize, that this stuff is leaving us wrecks. It's leading to chaos. It's destroying relationships. The bad thing was that he despaired. He didn't think that there was a way out of this, maybe because he didn't know the grace of God. And the issues that students have been upset about or thinking about have also changed. People used to be so worked up over abortion that they would scream at me just from giving a definition of a term. That happened once. And then the next big topic was that would get them screaming at each other or at me was homosexuality. I had a student screaming at me that the Jewish people who had been killed by Hamas on that terrible day a few years ago had deserved what they got.
Wow.
These issues change, but there is a separation also. Some of the students seem to be getting more extreme in various kinds of craziness.
Mm.
Some, on the other hand, are either turning to faith or that at least they're beginning to take these possibilities seriously and think about them and wonder whether it's true. A guy came to me after class one day and he said, we were talking about natural law. A student had asked a question about sexual ethics, and I gave a rational explanation of why the natural law teaching, which is also the Christian teaching, takes the shape that it does. And he said, I want to thank you for what you did in class today, because all my life I've heard that sexual ethics is just a bunch of irrational taboos that are completely arbitrary and just have nothing to do with anything. I'd never heard a rational defense of them before. So, okay, the fact that he could respond to it, did I convince him? I don't know. But the fact that he could respond to it is very encouraging. And that's something I wouldn't have seen 35 years ago in the classroom.
Mm.
It was different.
Mm.
And so there are also, although you see student organizations that are devoted to insane kinds of causes, you also see a much greater vigor among some of the Protestant and some of the Catholic groups on campus talking about the faith. You see more students being willing to mention in the classroom, oh yes, I went to the Ash Wednesday service, I did this, and they chat with each other about this. There is a change. It's such a mixture, it's hard to know the direction in which it's going.
That's fair, and that's my sense too. Your point that there's some students who are more extreme and maybe conspiracy laden, in some ways, kind of leads us to the question about your book. Tell us about
Yeah.
Pandemic of Lunacy, what it's about, and why you wrote it.
There are so many crazy things going on in society today. This isn't what most of the book is about, but it's a good example. There's the gender lunacy. When I tell some people who are not in academia or who don't follow social issues closely, don't think about that side of things, it's the economy stupid sort of person. I tell them about people who say that there are 95 genders or something like this. Often they giggle. They say, oh, they can't be serious, or it's just a grift. Well, a lot of them are serious. It may be a grift, but they're serious about their own grift. And it just gets to be nuts. Do you know what the latest so-called gender coming down the pike is?
Tell me.
Xenogender.
Okay.
You may have heard people say there's
Yeah.
cisgender and there's transgender and there's homosexual and there's demi-boy and femi-boy and there's this and there's that and the other. And now one of them is xenogender. A person who is xenogender has a gender that cannot be contained within human understandings of gender.
Mm.
So well, then how could anybody even know that it is one? This is just nuts. Or another thing that's loony. It's one thing to think that there is no God, although people don't really seriously realize, they don't think through what that means. Our God is not like Zeus, who's just a powerful being in the universe. Our God is the creator of the universe, that without which nothing else would be, the source of all its meaning. So if you say that being, if you say Zeus doesn't exist, fine, everything else is unchanged. But if you say God doesn't exist, then really nothing makes any sense at all. You may say, well, yes, but P follows from Q, but why should anything follow from anything? Or people will say, one person said, he writes that he discovered at a cocktail party, somebody asked him his religion, and he said, I'm an atheist. He says, I'm not an atheist. I just don't care whether there is a God. Now, if God is practically by definition the most important thing there is, how can you not care whether the most important thing is? How can you not care whether a being, the reality of whom would change everything for you, exists? Now that's evasion, really. People, it's another one of these things where I think it's self-deception. There are such strong inclinations built into us to know the truth and to know the meaning of things and to know the truth, especially about God, that you have to suppress, you have to suppress, you have to suppress, you have to distract yourself, you have to bury yourself in thumping music or constant activities or unrelenting talk with your friends and never have any time by yourself when you think about this in order to do that. Freud talked about suppressing the sexual impulse. This is so much harder, but people will do it. Why? Well, there are a lot of motives. Maybe because if I acknowledge that God was real, I might have to change. Maybe because if I acknowledge that he is good, that he's the source of all possible good, that he's better than I am, that he loves me more than that I love myself. He's so good it's scary. I don't want him to be that good. People have that reaction. So I talk about some of these lunacies. I wrote the book because I want to encourage people to look around at things and they think the world is going crazy. Or is it going crazy? Am I crazy? All my bosses and the entire human resources department, they all say I have to believe all these crazy things. You know, all of the, you know, the promotion review board, the accreditation board, all these people say I have to believe these things. Could it be that they're right? Am I going nuts? I want to reassure people they're not going nuts. I want to help them reconnect with their common sense. I want them to help them elevate that common sense. I want to help them to learn to think clearly, to face society's problems cheerfully rather than in despair or denial, and maybe be some good to their friends, their children, their spouses, their co-workers, other people in the world. That's what I hoped for in this book. So there's 30 lunacies that I discuss, but that's the thing each time.
30 lunacies. That's very interesting to get into. Well, Dr. J. Budziszewski, I have appreciated, benefited from your work since I think it was 2004. You wrote Ask Me Anything, Volume 1, a second volume on the meaning of sex is a great short volume from I think around 2014. What We Can't Not Know, or maybe it's What You Can't Not. Is it we or you?
It's what we can't not know. You got it right. You know, I get letters from English teachers all over the country saying that was a double negative.
And that's a part of the point of the title, of course. And then you got to follow up a line through the heart. So really appreciate it. You are one of my go-to scholars and thinkers when I think about what do we naturally know in terms of our moral conscience. And so keep up the good work. I look forward to diving into Pandemic of Lunacy and certainly commend that book and the others to my viewers and listeners. Folks, before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. Got some other topics like this coming up you will not want to miss. And if you thought about studying apologetics, this conversation today is a topic we explore in a lot of depth. in our apologetics program, online and distance. Information is below. Would love to train you in some more depth. Think about joining us. Dr. Jay Budziszewski, really appreciate you taking the time to come on. Thanks for a great conversation.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me.